Are you in it for the long haul? Are you working that job because it's what you want to be doing with the rest of your life? Or did you take the first available position to make some cash, pay your bills, put food on the table, and you've now been there for 5 years and I haven't made any progress to being anywhere else? Right? It's one thing to say, I'm going to take the short term solution to this problem, but you still need to be working on the long term fix. Right? There's few things as permanent as a short term fix, and that's not optimal. Right? You're going to wake up in 10 years if you do that and go, where the hell did it go? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? What opportunities have you missed? You got to look at these things and go, okay, if you're going to take the short term solution, which might be what needs to be done, right? It might be the best thing for you and for the situation you're in, but you also need to consider where you want to be in 5 years, in 10 years, even in 1 to 2 years. You want to look at what's coming up in the future and have a plan to get to where you want to go and not just stick at a entry level position for the rest of your life. It's hard these days if you work in corporate, particularly in the US. I don't know how it is in other countries, but there's not a lot of promotion from within. Normally, most of those positions you're going to have to come from without. And so in the US, that means you have 3 to 5 years at a company before you move on. And that's pretty common. It's not like the old days where you'd work somewhere for 20 or 30 years. You could still do that, but if you want to go up, you're not going to be able to do that and work at the same company for 20 to 30 years. There might be some exceptions, but generally speaking, that's not going to be the case. So you have to have a plan for how are you going to get to that next position, right? Maybe if you're lucky, there's promotions within, but then you still need to plan for how you're going to get up there, how you're going to convince whoever's making that promotion decision to promote you instead of hiring somebody new. And that means you're going to have to show that you have the skills to do the job, or they're going to have to be willing to let you learn on the job. And so that's a trade-off there. And that's a difficult thing because it means you have to make shorter term solutions rather than long term ones. And that, in the long run, I think is detrimental, right? Like if you buy a house that's under development, maybe you don't even live there. Maybe you flip it before you even live there and you make 200-300K profit off of it. And you roll that into somewhere else and you just keep doing that. And that, I'm sure, is contributing to the housing situation in the US. Whereas if you decide to, okay, I'm going to live here, well, then you're stuck there, right? You buy a house to live there for the long term, and then you are limited to the jobs that are in that area. Now, these days, there's remote work, and some of that's been pulled away from, but I think corporate will shift primarily to remote work at some point. I think a lot of them are still tied into corporate. I think you're going to see a large downturn in the office space market as more corporations realize we don't actually need to have an office, right? We just don't need one. People can work remotely and the job still gets done. And I think that a lot of them are still tied into those leases, but once those expire, you're going to see a lot of places moving away. There still will be office space and warehousing, of course, but I think there'll be a lot less. So I think that will open things up a lot more. On the downside, that does make it a larger global market. And so that might mean you're competing with a lot more people for that same job because it can be done anywhere in the US, not just somebody who's living in your particular town or the surrounding area. So there's always downsides to things. That's why you got to take the long-term view of your finances, I think. You could take short-term views on things, right? Like if your car breaks down and you have to get a new car, then you take what you can get and make it work. But ideally, you plan that ahead and don't have to take on the excess debt for it. You can reduce any excess debt burden on yourself. Reduce your monthly expenses there, and that means you're essentially saving whatever you would have spent on that. Which is an odd way of looking at it, but just consider it as an extra bill that's being deducted from your paycheck, and then as you go forward, you have more money, the less of those you have. But some of those aren't reasonable to get rid of, and you can't always be in a position to do that. And sometimes you have to make that decision for the short term because you have to, eat. So that's a difficult thing, I think. I think if more people took the long-term view, if it was possible for more people to take the long-term view, things would probably ultimately wind up in a better place. I think the short-term view leads to very detrimental decisions where the impacts will be felt after the person who makes that decision is long gone. I think that's part of what caused the problem in the 2008 housing crash. I think we're going to see that again in a few other industries. I think we're seeing that in a lot of these corporations where we can make this movie that meets the current present day interest, but doesn't hold up in the long term, that damages this brand that we purchased. Right? I think you see this in Star Wars. I think it'd be very difficult for anyone to argue that Star Wars is more successful today than it was before Disney bought it. It's certainly less popular today. Sure, the thing gets watched, but how many people are buying toys? How many people are buying any of the peripherals? How popular are the games? How popular are the movies and TV shows? We don't know those numbers because they're all on streaming platforms now. And sure, if they're released in theaters, right, we can see those numbers, and they haven't been good for the last few movies. But a lot of that, in my opinion, is because it was short-term decisions. It was, and a lot of those are made by committee, so there's not one person you can pin it on. At best, you could pin it on, whoever the head of the Disney Corporation is. But really, those decisions are going to be made by a committee of people, and that's why the movie kind of sucks, right? Like, even if it was in a direction people didn't like, the quality of it was not great. But that was true in the prequels too, although that was more due to CGI. Though I have to admit that the first two prequel movies are not good movies. They are very boring. And people only really like them because they ended on a good note, right? In episode 1, you had the duel with Darth Maul, which was fantastic. And in episode 2, you had the battle on Geonosis. And then episode 3, I remember being pretty decent, but I have to admit it's been a long time since I watched them. I do remember the last time I went to watch them, 1 and 2 were almost unwatchable because of how bad the CGI was, because it just hadn't held up well. But movie-wise, I don't quite remember, how bad or good episode 3 was. Maybe there's stuff I'm missing, and I should probably go back and rewatch those. But a lot of that, you see these franchises, right? Rings of Power might be another good one where they paid all this money for this franchise and then couldn't return on that investment. And was that because they paid too much upfront for it? And so it would be physically impossible for them to return on investment. And I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's true. I think they could have, had they made something better. And I'm not saying I could do a better job because I don't know the first thing about making a TV show, but I can say it didn't look interesting to watch. It didn't look good to watch on some like the costuming and stuff, because you're now being compared to the movies as opposed to just being in a vacuum. Maybe if there had never been Lord of the Rings movies and they came up with this show, it might have been, well, it doesn't look awful, it looks okay. Maybe not, I'm not sure, but you're going to go and compare it to the other main Tolkien property, which was Lord of the Rings movies, and those looked a lot better. The armor for, a lot of the stuff in Rings of Power looked plastic. It didn't look real. It killed the verisimilitude. And that ties back into that long versus short-term decision making, where, the producers of that show, the people making that show, probably didn't expect to be working on it for season 2. Like, you look at the sequel trilogy, you had 2 different directors. It was supposed to be 3, if I remember correctly, where, each person's making a different movie. So it doesn't matter that you trash the previous guy's stuff and make it impossible for the next guy, right? Because you're not going to be working on it, so who cares? You don't have to resolve that. You can leave that up to somebody else, and it's now somebody else's problem. And I think that's pretty detrimental. If you can remove as many of those, well, I'll deal with it tomorrow, and just take care of it today, find the correct solution today, even if you have to implement it tomorrow, but find, what you can do that's either going to make that at least not worse when you have to deal with it in the future. I think you'll be in a better place, right? If you make those decisions that are better for you in the long term than merely short term, I think you'll be in a better place. Well, that's all I have for you today. I will catch you next week with another video.